Welcome to our 13th annual Writers' Symposium by the Sea at Point Loma Nazarene University. I'm Dean Nelson on the journalism faculty at Point Loma Nazarene University, and with us today is Philip Yancey, one of the most prominent and thoughtful authors, especially on themes of spirituality. Books of his titles are things like What's So Amazing About Grace, Disappointment with God, Soul Survivor, How My Faith Survived the Church, The Jesus I Never Knew. His book, Where Is God When It Hurts, had a special edition made for after the 9/11 attacks, distributed to Red Cross workers throughout the area and to emergency workers in New York and Washington. And his most recent book is called Prayer, Does It Make Any Difference? His books have sold more than 5 million copies, and he's one of the editors at large for Christianity Today magazine. Philip, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, Dean.
I've noticed through reading your books, Philip, that on these spirituality themes, that regardless of the topic, whether you're talking about the Bible or whether you're talking about prayer or Jesus or the church or whatever, there is this sense that you're saying throughout each of these topics, things are not so simple as I once thought they were. Now, 5 million copies, you've sold a lot of books, but I'm thinking, wouldn't they rather have 7 steps to something or 5 languages to something and here you are, you're taking these topics and you just say, well, let's look at life, or these topics like a little gemstone. Let's turn it this way and see how the light hits it. Let's turn it this way and see how the light hits it. Why can't you just come up with a formula or something for us?
Probably would have sold more million books if I did that. A lot of people convey that Jesus is the answer. That's a phrase you see. I come from the South. Sometimes it's written on graffiti. Jesus is the answer. I find that Jesus doesn't make life simpler. Jesus makes life more complicated. There are a lot of things that I wish I didn't have to care about. I wish I didn't have to care about global poverty. I wish I didn't have to care about racism. I wish I could just pull into my little hole and live my little life and indulge myself narcissistically, but Jesus doesn't allow me that option. So if I'm going to be a serious follower of Jesus, life isn't simpler. Life is more complicated. Richer, fuller, more rewarding, ultimately, but certainly not simpler.
I suspect that the fact that you started out as a journalist has something to do with this too, where you're taking complex issues and trying to communicate them in some way. Did being a journalist help you in these kinds of big topics that you're writing about?
That is, you're right. My identity is as a journalist, and a journalist is a generalist. We know a little bit about a lot of things, but we don't know a lot about any one thing. And so we take complicated things, but we try to make them simple. We try to communicate them to people who aren't experts, because we're not experts. So if you look at some of the topics that you mentioned, when I was writing the book on Jesus, somebody wrote me and said, do you realize that there were 25,000 books about Jesus published this year? Thanks a lot. Who needs one more book on Jesus? But it's a huge issue, or prayer. When I started, I had no idea what I would say, because I didn't write because I'm an expert on prayer. I wrote because I'm very bad at prayer. And most of my books, I start like that. I start from a standpoint of ignorance, sometimes willful ignorance, because I'm there to represent my reader. And I'll take a huge topic like prayer, the problem of pain, Jesus, but I'll wander around the edges thinking, not, this is what I have to say to you down there, but my goodness, what in the world am I going to say about this huge topic? Let's just dive in, and together we'll go and attack it.
Now, I know part of what you read informs how you write as well, and you've said that you try to keep a steady diet of Shakespeare and Russian authors. Why is that?
Shakespeare and Russian authors capture the human experience in a more complete and revealing way than anyone I know. I went on an experiment one time where my idea was to read one play of William Shakespeare each week. I didn't make it. We moved to Colorado in the meantime. It took me about a year and a half. But when I started, it was usually Wednesday night, as it turned out. And when I first started the first few weeks, I thought, oh boy, this sounds like work. This is like going to school. Well, once I got into the rhythm, once I didn't have to keep looking at each little Elizabethan word in the footnotes to figure it out, it became an enjoyable night. It became one of the most informative nights of the week. And why? Because Shakespeare knew what human nature was. Any honest psychiatrist would tell you that Shakespeare knew more about the human psyche than any psychiatry book, all psychiatry books put together. And the same would be true of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. The two of them together, even though they're writing over a century ago about upper-class Russians, generally, before the 20th century and before the Russian Revolution and the changes, somehow they captured that universal chord. I find in my own writing, Dean, that if the more specifically I write about myself, the more detailed, the more personal, individual, specific detail, the more likely it is to strike a universal chord. So there's kind of an irony at work. But if I write very specifically about what it's like to grow up in a really toxic, fundamentalist, screaming, hellfire and brimstone, legalistic, angry, racist church in Atlanta, Georgia, I don't tend to get letters from people who grew up in that kind of church. I tend to get letters from a Seventh-day Adventist who thought drinking coffee was a great sin, or a New York Catholic who, when a nun slapped her hands when she was in the third grade. Why? I don't even know what that experience is like, but only by writing the specificity can I possibly strike that universal chord. And I think that's what people like Shakespeare, Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky did. They wrote in a very different time about very different people, but they did so in a way that struck that universal chord.
Is that why the book To Kill a Mockingbird was so important to you when you were starting to this whole detoxifying process? Was there something in that book that resonated in that same way with you?
Yes, there were several books that challenged me. One of the problems of growing up in a toxic church is that when you find out that some things are wrong, then you're tempted to throw everything out. And we were taught doctrinaire racism from the pulpit. We were taught that the dark races had been cursed by God and that they could never rise to positions of prominence. They make good servant class, so they're very good waiters and all that, but they could never. Well, one year, I was a junior in high school. I was assigned a job at the Center for Disease Control, which was then called the Communicable Disease Center in Atlanta. And I knew that my supervisor for the summer was a PhD in biochemistry. I walked into his office. It's a black man, Dr. Cherry. And this contradicted everything I was told in church. About the same time, I was reading books like To Kill a Mockingbird, Black Like Me, an extraordinary book by a man who took injections, took drugs, so that his skin actually turned black. Here's exactly the same man. Not a thing has changed except his skin color. And now when he walks down the streets in New Orleans, he's treated radically different. And I realized, it's not, this is the same person. There's something else going on here. And literature was an eye-opener for me. It was a window into another world, because when you read a book like To Kill a Mockingbird, it goes around the culture I was raised in, the church I was raised in, the family I was raised in, and opens a window to a different way of looking.
Now, I understand the rock star Bono is a fan of yours. Now, he actually called you, didn't he? Or one of his people, and wanted to hang out?
I suppose you could say that. I don't listen to much music written after about 1910, frankly. So I had to joke with my church when this thing first happened. I thought Bono was married to Cher, and I thought U2 was a spy plane. But some people in my church cut some CDs for me and said, "You really need to listen to these before you met him." He had read my book, What's So Amazing About Grace, and actually wrote a song called Grace and speaks eloquently about the difference between grace and karma. And he came to Denver. We were supposed to meet in London. That fell through. His father got sick and ultimately died that night. So I thought, well, so I guess that's over. But he came to Denver, and we had lunch with the band. There's quite a story there.
You had lunch with Bono, just because you wrote a book.
Bono and Edge and Adam and Larry and all these guys.
You're making me sick.
They're just ordinary guys who make $100 million a day.
Tell us about the lunch.
Yes, well, the entire lunch, we asked for a place with a private dining room, and the entire time there were these teeny boppers that had cafe curtains across the window to the street, and these teeny boppers were jumping up and down, so you'd see cute girls' heads, throughout, and Bono would just blow them kisses and wave, and we never saw the same wait person twice, because everybody was bidding to go refill the glasses, and my wife had this rather crazy idea. She said, they're coming to our territory, and we should pay for lunch. I said, are you crazy? These guys make $100 million on this tour. Why should we pay for it? They won't even see the bill. It goes into some, we went over this several times, and she kept bringing it back up. She said, didn't you write a book about grace? This is very unfair.
Yeah, don't you hate it? When spouses take that stuff literally.
I know. So we did arrange that it would be charged to my credit card in advance. Well, the guys in the band were ordering, we'll have one of these. Oh, let's have some nice wine. They're ordering, and I'm sitting there going, ka-ching, 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 But she was absolutely right. I don't think anyone has ever picked up a check for them, and they were very impressed, and then invited us to stay with them the next time we came to Ireland, which happened to be in September, so we did. We visited them over there as well. And Bono he's a very bright, why did he have lunch with me? Well, partly, he had read my book, but also, he knows I'm a writer. He's deeply concerned about his issues of AIDS at that point, and then the debt reduction in Africa, and he wanted a chance to bend my ear, to say, you're a voice to the Christian world particularly, why don't you get on this bandwagon? Why don't you realize this is the most important issue of our age? And he was very compelling.
So he had an agenda for this.
He did have an agenda, yeah.
But it'd be fun just hanging out, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it was kind of fun hanging out.
Yeah.
Till the bill came.
Can I ask how much the bill was?
I don't know, $300 for 5 people for lunch. That's not so bad.
You want to go to lunch after this? Now, let me ask you something about your writing process. You have said that 80% of your life is sitting in the basement struggling to write. You've said it's an isolated, boring, paranoid existence where the only words you utter when writing are tall latte, please, to the Starbucks person. Is that true? 80% of your life?
That is true, yeah. Of course, the writing breaks down into different phases. There are some times when I'll research a book and spend months before I actually write a word, but I'm sitting there reading books, taking notes, filing it away on a computer, doing all that. It's a lonely existence. And, Dean, I used to think if I do this long enough, then it'll get easy. And it actually doesn't get easier, it gets harder.
Really? After 16 books?
Well, there have been 20 now. You're using outdated PR material there, but...
I was thinking 4 of them were a piece of cake.
I see, okay. But the problem is, the longer I have done it, the more things I learn about things I am doing wrong. And in the composing stage, every time I write, I come up with one word. Oh, I got one word. Oh, no, now I got to find another word. And I have these voices going on all day long. That is such a cliche. You've said this before. This is plagiarism. You're stealing it from somebody. You say the same things over and over. What a flat verb. These kind of voices all day long. Now, later in the editing phase, those voices do me a favor because I can usually go back and improve them. But in the composing stage, there's this weight that hangs over every word, and each word I come up with, the weight just transfers to the next word. So I wouldn't even subject my wife to that. I have a place out in the mountains, and I go on my own and stay out there as long as it takes to get that first draft done.
You go away from home to write that first draft. I've heard you say because you get pretty irritable and cranky and not very fun to be around.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, but you also love nature. So how does nature inform how you write? Or is it a good way to just take a break from that 80% of crankiness? I know I called your house one time and Janet said you were out snowshoeing. I just thought, how cool is that? But does that help you?
Reconnecting with the planet is what I need to do. I wrote an article one time called "Is Writing a Psychotic Act?" And and if you look up the definition of psychosis in a manual, they would say, well, a psychotic is a person who has an alternate state of reality, different than everybody else's, and confuses the two. Well, that's the definition of writing. You create your own state of reality, and it's far more interesting than everybody else's reality, but only you live in that. And if you are really living in that, it's hard to enter other people's. This is more interesting. These are your characters. Every word comes out of you. It's a narcissist's dream. And so if you do that all day long, it's all inside your head, of course, then what happens to the rest of your body? The surveys I read show that more writers, percentage-wise, become alcoholics. I'm sure we drink more coffee. It's because we need to do something with our hands, We smoke, we drink, we do whatever. We just move our bodies. What I try to do is use the rest of my body at some point during the day. So I'll work all morning till late afternoon. About the time NPR comes on, then I'll go out and go snowshoeing or cross-country skiing or mountain biking or something like that. Just pound, pound, pound. Clear my head a little bit, reconnect with the planet, and then I'll come back in for an evening psychosis.
You like to work from outlines, don't you? When you write, you aren't just finding out what you think about stuff. Have you just created these structures? That's how you spend a lot of your time, is creating how these things are going to be structured, right?
Right. Outlining is a great way of writer's avoidance. The more you outline, the more you delay that period of putting words on paper. And so often, my outlines are as long as my chapters. Oddly enough, the chapters don't resemble the outline.
So why do you do the outline?
Well, writing involves two different sides of your brain, the left side and the right side. And the left side, do I have this right, is the logical coherent side?
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
The left side is the logical coherence. That's the outlining side. And so that's when I approach a topic or an article or a chapter, that's how I approach it. Let's see, what should go first here, then what should follow, how do I wrap this up, where should the illustrations go, and all that. And I think I've got that exactly down. And then I start to write, and the right side of my brain says, excuse me.
I have a word to say.
And what I thought was going to be the introduction to the story in one paragraph becomes the entire article, And what can I do? But I can't get to that right side without starting through the left side. Some people may have a way of doing that. I haven't found that.
Now, you suffered a horrific car accident about a year ago, broke your neck, and it was possible that you could have very easily died in that thing, and had to be just kind of immobilized for a long time. Did that have any impact on you and on how you write and how you think and reflect about stuff?
It did. There was a period of time after the accident where I felt like I was going through what I call a daze of grace. And that was, I had faced death. I was strapped in, my head strapped down, neck brace, and...
Your car went off a mountain road.
That's right, rolled over 5 times, and fortunately landed right side up. If I had had a broken neck, was upside down, undid my seatbelt, it would have been very bad. It was bad enough. And so I they strapped me in, took me to the hospital, did all the CAT scan things. It's great. This little town in Colorado had a CAT scan, but they didn't have a radiologist. So they had to modem all the images to Australia, where it was a normal weekday. Took an hour to send all the images there, an hour for them to diagnose, and they came back and said, he's got a broken neck and it's right next to a major artery. You got to redo all the CAT scans with an arterial dye. So they redid all that. As it turned out, I was 7 hours strapped in. And at one point, the doctor said, you've got one arm free with a cell phone. We've got a jet standing by to fly you to Denver for emergency surgery. If indeed the artery was nicked and is bleeding, you should call the people you love and tell them goodbye. And so it was one of those moments, that everything changes from this moment on. And I did spend a lot of time thinking, well, what a blessed life I have had. I've traveled many countries. What are my regrets? And I had two. One was, I haven't climbed all the 14,000-foot mountains in Colorado. I've got 3 left. There are 54. So last summer, after I recovered as much as I could, I climbed those last 3. So I got that one out of the way. And and the other thing I thought about a lot was what have you not written yet that if you died, you would regret? Because, I could have died the next hour. It seemed real at the time. And this theme, again, that I started with of the detox is something that I'm still struggling with, the best way to express that. But every day, I'm not exaggerating, every day, the mail comes, or the email comes, I get a letter from someone who was wounded deeply by the church. Someone who is searching in a spiritual sense, wants to connect with God, maybe is attracted to Jesus, but has really been hurt by the church. And I have to find a way to express my own life, because most of the wounds they describe, I think, oh, I can top that. Let me tell you about my church. But it has a redemptive ending in my life, because I was able to reconnect. And I realized that God was not this scowling, judgmental God that I was brought up with, but rather the universe at its center is a smile. It's an embrace. It's the story of the prodigal son. And I want to convey that message to people who have been wounded, because that is my story. And I've done it in little bits and pieces here and there, but I haven't done it in a complete way. So I need to find a way to do that now.
And this gave you a little bit of urgency, perhaps, to say, I need to get after this.
It did.
We have a lot of people watching and in our audience here who are aspiring writers. You got some advice for them?
Stop! It's not too late. It's a hard thing. I can't imagine being anything else. This is my choice, and I can't imagine making another choice. But it is a very hard thing. When I've climbed some of these mountains, some of them are very hard, and I've been in places where it's 2,000 feet down, and I don't see a way out, and I think, I'm shaking. You get that shaky leg syndrome, and I think, oh, man, I don't know if I can get out of this. And then I'll think, oh, yeah, but it's easier than writing. And I just scramble up to the top of the mountain. But I don't know of anything harder, frankly. And my advice, I would say, it is a learnable skill. I learned how to write sentences, how to write active verbs, by studying the masters one by one and part by part. How do you do a sentence? How do you do a paragraph? How do you do an article? How do you do a book? It is a learnable skill. You need that kind of personality. You need an introspective, sorting through personality, which most writers have. Don't do it alone would be one of my words of advice. If you can find a group around you that gives you feedback, that's the hardest thing for writers. There's so many kids, I'm sure, here at the school and teaching creative writing, you've seen this great talent come out, and they're all into self-expression. Let's express myself. But you don't make a living in self-expression. You make a living by connecting to people who want to pay money to say, this was worth my time. And to do that, you need to learn to take criticism and feedback, and you need to learn to improve. And a writer's group is a great way to do that. So that's one thing I recommend to aspiring writers.
The one thing about criticism, I noticed this on the back of your book, Prayer, Does It Make Any Difference? It says, in his most powerful book since What's So Amazing About Grace, Philip Yancey probes the very heart. You wrote a lot of books in between there. And you got your own publisher saying, oh, this is the most powerful one since that. What are they saying about those ones that you wrote in the meantime? They're saying, those aren't so.
Well, they don't understand them. No. You know, people who write jacket copy, what they really mean is, in his best-selling, we hope it's his best-selling book since What's Amazing About Grace.
Okay, so they weren't really criticizing the ones you had done in between.
No, but I do get criticism, so I know about criticism.
And yet, you keep going.
Yes, and I must say that I have found, to my surprise, that the more risk I take, the more I am rewarded. So, for instance, What's Amazing About Grace that you mentioned, I remember clearly when I mailed off that manuscript to the publisher, I said to my wife, this is probably the last book that I'll write for a Christian publisher. It's got a whole chapter on a prominent gay activist, Mel White, who is a friend of mine, and a whole chapter on Bill Clinton, not the poster child of American evangelicals. So I said, when I get this out, I'm going to be blackballed. You know, they're going to stop carrying my books in Christian bookstores. And now it's being used by ad copywriters, you know, the most powerful book since. I was wrong. I was wrong. And one of the gifts that I'm grateful for in growing up is that growing up in a fundamentalist, radically fundamentalist environment, I learned where the landmines were. And I learned that I'm not radical. Jesus is radical. It's Jesus, not me. And if I'm talking about grace, if I can ground that in the gospel, which is pretty easy to do, it's what the gospel is all about, the reader's got the problem. And if you do it correctly, then they have to just confront. Not everybody accepted Jesus in his day, obviously. But the word grace is not my word. It's the Bible's word. And if I can keep grounding that in the Bible, the people that I thought were going to draw and quarter me actually bought my books.
Philip Yancey, thank you so much for being with us today. That's good.